The theme this week for these interfaith lecture series is Inventing God, a brief history of religions. And we are very fortunate today to have our distinguished guest lecturer, Professor Alec Ryrie. Alec Ryrie was born in London, brought up there, and also in Washington, D.C. After a formative year teaching in a school in rural Zimbabwe, he studied history and theology at the universities, are you ready, of Cambridge, St. Andrews, and Oxford, and spent 2 years working as a parish assistant in the Church of England. During his academic career, Professor Ryrie has taught at the University of Birmingham, and Alec, in the South, that would mean Alabama. But for where you come from, that is the UK, University of Birmingham in the UK. And he served 2 fellowships at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Now he's professor of the history of Christianity at Durham University, also in the UK, where from 2012 until 2015, he was the head of the Department of Theology and Religion, and is also now visiting professor in the history of religion at Gresham College in London. Alec is a licensed lay reader, lay preacher in the Church of England. He specializes in the history and spirituality of the Reformation in England and in Scotland, but also has interest in the history of Protestantism more widely, in the history of religious tolerance and intolerance, and in the historical relationships among religion, science, and magic. Professor Ryrie is co-editor of the Journal of Ecclesiastical History. He is the author of 6 books, including most recently in 2017, Protestants, the Faith That Made the Modern World. His current research is on the history of the experience of religious doubt and unbelief. Professor Ryrie is married to Victoria. They've been married since 1995. They have 2 sons, Ben and Adam, aged 11 and 8, and with their 2 cats, they all live in the Pennine Hills windswept house in England. The title of this presentation today is Protestants, the Faith That Made the Modern World, and you'll be pleased to know that Professor Ryrie will do a book signing at the Hall of Missions immediately after his lecture. His books can be purchased there as well. We're grateful to the H. Parker and Emma O. Sharp Lectureship Fund for providing support for this lecture today. Would you join me in thanking that family for their generosity? Professor Alec Ryrie is here for the very first time, so let's give him an enthusiastic Chautauqua welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here with you, a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming today. So your theme for this week has been the history of religion. And I want to talk to you this afternoon about one of the most dynamic, varied, and influential religious movements of modern times, Protestant Christianity. This is a movement whose 500th anniversary we're marking this year. But I want to start by saying a little bit about how I'm doing it, and also about how I did it in the book Surveying the Subject, which came out a couple of months ago. I deliberately called the book Protestants rather than Protestantism. And that's because the history of religion, it seems to me, is the history of people. It too often gets told as a set of abstract concepts, which can tell you everything and nothing about the subject. It's all very well to learn what people believe, but the vital thing, I think, is to understand why they believe it, why it matters so much to them, why they're willing to turn their lives upside down for their beliefs, to build their identities around them, to die for them, and to kill for them. So what I want to do this afternoon is not to define terms or discuss doctrines. We'll have time to pick up some of those sorts of issues and questions if people would like to. Instead, I want to do 2 things. First, I want to introduce you to some people. There's something not too far off 1 billion Protestants alive today, and many more who've gone before. But I'm going to pick out three of them, a mixed crew spanning the 500 years, one from the 16th century, one from the 18th century, one from the 20th century. Between them, I think these three people will show us something of Protestantism's variety, both for good and ill. And then in the second half of my lecture, I want to talk about some of the themes that they'll have introduced us to, especially about how Protestantism has played out in the political sphere, in the past, in our own times, and where it might be going next. So hold on tight, we've got a lot of ground to cover. Our first character. Well, I did promise you no theology, but the first one is inescapable. I can't not begin with Martin Luther. But I don't want to dwell on him as a thinker, because to me the point of Luther's story is that his Christianity was a matter of the heart and of the guts more than it was of the intellect. His basic story is simple enough. His father sent him to study to be a lawyer in 1505 when he was in his early 20s, and he threw over lawyering after 6 weeks and went off to become a monk instead, much to his father's disgust, and he never got over that distaste for law. But the monastery didn't turn out to be much of a refuge. He remembered those early years in the monastery as a time of torment, imprisoned as he felt by his own sinfulness. Its grip on him grew stronger the more he struggled against it. Seemingly trivial sins tortured him. His confessor, who was exasperated by the melodrama this novice was generating around himself, told him to go away and commit some real sins. But his superior, who I think had a better idea of what was going on, packed him off to university to go and study theology instead, to the newly founded University of Wittenberg. And it was there, over the dozen years after he moved there in 1507, that Luther gradually came to understand the Christian gospel in a way that seemed to him utterly life-changing. Before any of this was a theological system, it eventually became that, but before it was a theological system, for Luther, it was a love affair. Luther discovered that God loved him and forgave him in a way that he had never imagined before. And it unlocked in him an answering, recklessly extravagant passion, which he pursued beyond all the bounds set for him by church and by tradition. This was an intense, a desolating, but also intoxicating passion for God, sparked by his life-upending glimpse of God's incomprehensible, terrible, beautiful love for him. Like anyone who's in love, he finds it incredible that his beloved should love him, completely unworthy as he is. But instead, he discovers over the long years of prayer and study that God loves him and loves him wildly, irresponsibly, beyond all reason, that God in Jesus Christ had laid down his life for him, as he'd always known, of course, but he now discovered that that sacrifice wasn't a transaction. It wasn't a process. It wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't an offer. It certainly wasn't a reproach. It was a mere gift. Now, normally when a professor has a new idea, then that's pretty much where it stops. But I don't mean to sound bitter. But by a series of accidents, or providences if you prefer, this one snowballed. In 1517, Luther was moved to make a public protest against a fairly iffy fundraising scheme being run by his local archbishop, which looked particularly dodgy in light of Luther's new conviction that salvation was an entirely free gift. That's the event whose quincentenary we're marking this year. But Luther didn't realize that he was starting the Reformation. He was just trying to start an argument. But his language was inflammatory. The church hierarchy ordered him to shut up, treated it as a matter of obedience. If I do that, I might be booming slightly less weirdly. Anyway. So they ordered him to shut up, and he won't. He's a lover defending his beloved's honor. And so he discovers within himself fantastic reserves of stubbornness. He defies the establishment that's trying to close him down. And in a way that may seem familiar, he does it by outflanking them on new media. He discovers that he could write polemical German with vivid, throat-grabbing directness. A fountain of short pamphlets surge out from the printing press. This is a technology that's been around for a few decades, but nobody's exploited it like this before. His traditionalist opponents are left gasping. They're suddenly facing a mass movement of a kind that they'd never had to deal with before. By the time he's formally accused of heresy, he's already a celebrity. And his local prince won't let him go to trial because that local prince was also the founder of Wittenberg University, and universities like having celebrities on the staff. I really don't mean to sound bitter. By the time the law caught up with him, Luther had formulated a complete theological critique of the Catholic establishment. He'd been excommunicated, and just to seal the matter, he'd declared that the Pope was Antichrist. But finally, in late 1520, Luther was summoned to attend the Parliament or Diet of the Holy Roman Empire, the German Empire, at the city of Worms, in order to be tried and condemned as a heretic. He was promised safe conduct to come to his trial, but promises like that had been broken before. Luther fully expected that he would become a martyr. But he went anyway, traveling like Christ to Jerusalem. It was a 300-mile journey, pausing to preach on the way. Friends warned him of the dangers ahead. He replied that if there were as many devils in Worms as there were slates on the roofs, he would still go. But he arrived on the 17th of April, 1521, to find the rooftops crowded not with devils, but with supporters and spectators. The streets were so thronged to be impassable, people had climbed onto the roofs to see him. He was borne through, then kept waiting outside the palace for 2 hours. The crowd pressed around him. Voices shouted to him to stand firm. Somebody cried out, "Blessed is the womb that bore you." Finally, he was allowed in, brought before all the assembled majesty of church and state, the emperor, princes, bishops, and asked if he would recant his errors. And he replied, cautiously but firmly, that much as he might wish to, his conscience was captive to the word of God. He would only recant his views if it could be shown to him on the basis of Scripture and Scripture alone that he was wrong. Now, he expected that that moment of defiance was going to cost him his life. But in fact, the naive young German emperor honored the promise of safe conduct. And so instead of costing Luther his life, it defined it for him. And that moment caught half of Europe's imagination, a conscience standing alone, speaking truth to power. He went from being a celebrity to being a revolutionary leader to within only a handful of years being a new establishment. And new churches began to be founded that were being called already Lutheran. He never liked that. He said that this Reformation wasn't his doing. He said, "I simply taught and preached and wrote God's word. Otherwise I did nothing. And while I slept or drank Wittenberg beer with my friends, the word so greatly weakened the papacy that no prince or emperor ever inflicted such losses on it. I did nothing. The word did everything." Now, that's a statement of faith, not of fact, and it's not nearly as humble as he makes it out to be. But I want you to notice two things there, apart from the beer, which is absolutely vintage Luther. I want you to notice two things there. First, that sense that he'd set loose something which was no longer under his or anyone's control. And that's entirely authentic. And secondly, which we're going to come back to, the insistence that for all that he'd started a revolution that was going to dominate the entire continent's politics for hundreds of years, it wasn't he who'd confronted princes and emperors. It was simply the power of the word of God. You don't necessarily need to believe him to recognize the significance of it. But before we come to that, let's meet our second character, very different person. She was born into slavery on the island of Antigua in about 1718. She was apparently named Shelley when she was a girl, but when she was 6 or 7, she was either kidnapped or sold. It felt like a kidnapping to her, onto the neighboring island of St. Thomas, that's now in the US Virgin Islands, but back then was a Danish colony. And she became a house slave for a wealthy Dutch family of planters on the island. They renamed her Rebecca. That was the name she went by for the rest of her life. They taught her to speak and read Dutch. and they raised her in their Calvinist faith. And when her master died, he freed the teenage Rebecca in his will. It wasn't long after that that a small group of German missionaries from the radical Moravian church arrived on the island and began preaching to the nearly 4,000 slaves there. Rebecca was one of their first converts, and not yet 20, she became central to their mission. As a free black woman who spoke the island's many languages, she could go where they couldn't. She visited slave quarters, she preached to women, she organized self-supporting study groups. The Moravians reported back that she was very accomplished in the teachings of God and that everything depends on her. One of the missionaries, a man named Matthias Freundlich, went so far as to marry her. This, despite some initial misgivings on her part. The deal that they eventually struck seems to have been that she would marry him and they would straight away adopt 9 orphans. Freundlich may have hoped that the marriage would give her some protection from the rising hostility of the plantation owners. If so, it didn't work, because the marriage was, of course, also a deeply provocative statement about racial equality. The couple were both arrested, tried, convicted on fabricated charges of burglary and fomenting rebellion, and she was sentenced to be sold back into slavery. She was repeatedly offered the chance to save herself from this fate by renouncing her Moravian faith and her marriage, and she steadfastly refused. Disaster was averted at the 11th hour when the Count von Zinzendorf, the Moravian Church's aristocratic leader, happened by, as it seems, mere chance to visit the island. And once you've got a nobleman on the scene, then everything can be tidied over. He spoke to the colonial governor, and it was all sorted out. But Rebecca and her husband were deported. They set off back to his home in Germany in 1741. And en route, he died. So she arrived in a strange country, in a strange continent, and discovered that she was a celebrity, that this community knew all about her from the correspondence. She was welcomed as a hero. She became a close part of the life of that community. In 1746, she was ordained as a deaconess. She's certainly one of, if not the first Protestant woman ever to be ordained. In the same year, she married again, this time to a Moravian convert from West Africa, a man named Christian Protten, whose story is almost as tangled as hers, but we don't have time to do that. In the following decade, the two of them traveled to Christiansborg in what's now Ghana to establish a school, and that's where they lived out their days. Now, she's evidently an extraordinary woman. The one portrait of her has her wearing a suppressed smile that makes the Mona Lisa look like an open book. If you're interested in her life, there's a terrific book about her called Rebecca's Revival by John Sensbach. But her story is also the kind of extraordinary story that Protestantism was making possible. Luther's original love affair was now starting to spread out across the planet, seeping into all sorts of social spaces, dissolving structures of discrimination like an acid, with its amazingly subversive principle that all human beings stand directly and equally before God. But if that's an uplifting story, that's not always the way it works out. Let's meet our 20th century character. Walter Grundmann was a rising star in German academic theology in the 1930s, and also, which was simply a wise career move for any ambitious young German of the time, a member of the Nazi Party. In 1939, when he was aged only 33, he was handpicked for a plum academic job, heading up a new theological research institute. The home of this institute was the Wartburg Castle in Eisenach. This was where Luther had spent a year in hiding, where he translated the New Testament into German. It's a very deliberate echo. When Grundmann gave his inaugural lecture at this institution, he declared that its purpose was nothing less than a second Reformation. Luther had thrown off the Pope's stranglehold on Christianity. Now, he declared, the work of this institute for the study and eradication of Jewish influence on German church life was revealing what he called the deformation of New Testament ideas into Old Testament preconceptions, so that now angry recognition of the Jewishness in the Old Testament and parts of the New has arisen. Christianity, he said, had to be purged of Jewishness. in parallel to the way that the Nazi state was purging Christendom of Jews. But the key thing to understand about Grundtvig's Institute is that it wasn't really part of the Nazi project. It badly wanted to be, but the regime was keeping it at arm's length. There was a short period in 1933, when the Nazis first took power, when the regime openly backed the so-called German Christian movement. This was a party within Germany's established Protestant church, which saw itself as the parachurch wing of the Nazi party. But after those first few months, the regime deliberately withdrew from church politics, even allowed a movement opposed to the German Christians, the so-called confessing church, to be formed and to survive, although it was subject to quite a lot of harassment. Grundtvig and the German Christians were faced with what seemed to them an acute dilemma. They wanted to forge a religion which felt to them recognizably Christian, but which was sufficiently anti-Jewish that the Nazis could accept it as their official creed. Their problem was that most senior Nazis found this project contemptible. The German Christians in 1938 organized a nationwide oath of loyalty to Hitler to be sworn by all pastors and clergy. The regime refused to accept it. When war broke out in 1939, the German Christians rushed to provide military chaplains to help the nation celebrate this great uniting sacrament of blood. But to their dismay, the numbers and rights of chaplains were systematically restricted, and a so-called Uriah law even had chaplains deliberately sent to the front of combat. That was only a means of accelerating the view which Hitler had already privately reached, that the best thing is to let Christianity die a natural death. During the war, some German Christian churches took to declaring themselves officially anti-Jewish. One German Christian publication in 1944 even looked forward to a post-war world completely purged of Judaism. That's an unusually direct reference to the final solution. The centerpiece of this effort, though, was the De-Judaization Institute that Grundtvig headed at Eisenach. For him, the project of de-Judaizing Christianity was a moral as well as a political priority. After all, a de-Judaized world, he believed, was dawning. If Christianity was going to survive in this world, as these earnest Christian scholars believed it must, they had to prove that there was a middle road between corrupted Jewish Christianity and its secularist and neo-pagan mockers. Their proudest achievement was published in the summer of 1940. It was formally titled The Message of God. This was nothing less than a de-Judaized Bible, and it was accompanied by a hymn book for a de-Judaized church. Over 200,000 copies of both books were printed, which, given that access to paper was tightly restricted in wartime, shows that they did still have some friends. Soldiers at the front were using them, the very embodiment of Nazi virtue. Maybe the dream wasn't dead after all. But in fact, nothing could demonstrate its futility more than these wretched books. The hymn book has more German folk songs than Christian hymns in it. The hymns had been purged of anything reflective or penitential, indeed of almost any reference to Christian doctrine. There's not much in it apart from militaristic triumphalism and domestic sentimentality. And as to the de-Judaized Bible, well, it's quite brief. The entire Old Testament is, of course, gone. The New Testament is heavily redacted. Even so, its editors find that they're not able to eliminate Judaism entirely. Jesus' racial identity isn't stated, but he still teaches in the Jewish temple, even daringly quotes a Jewish psalm. And the fact that St. Paul was Jewish simply can't be avoided. It's often said that you can twist the Bible to mean anything, but I think the efforts of the De-Judaization Institute prove that even if you abandon almost all of it, there are still meanings that it will simply refuse to bear. And the regime still had no wish to sponsor this almost content-free faith. In 1941, Grundtvig was bluntly told by an official in the propaganda ministry that there is no interest in synthesizing Christian teachings with Nazism, nor proving that a reshaped Christianity is not fundamentally Jewish. It's almost pitiable. Emptying Christianity of all its substance didn't, he discovered, make anybody want the husk. But it won't do to feel too sorry for Grundtmann. His institute, while it lasted, seems to have been a thoroughly agreeable place to work. Most of its alumni managed to shake off any unpleasant associations after the war and go on to successful academic careers. Grundtmann himself, after a cursory show of repentance, became both the rector of a prestigious seminary in East Germany and an active informer for the East German secret police. So Protestantism is a religion that can encompass Rebecca Freundlich and Walter Grundtmann. Both of them are there throughout its history. On the one side, you've got the reformers, the prophets of human equality and freedom, 16th century prophets like John Knox, who led a rebellion against a queen who wouldn't grant religious freedom, and who declared that in that struggle, as he put it, all man is equal. He was quite clear that that didn't extend to women. But 17th century figures like the English Levellers, who first argued for representative democracy in the sense that we know it, or the Quakers, with their radical opposition to social hierarchies of any kind, were willing to make that further leap. 18th century abolitionists, 19th century liberals, 20th century campaigners for democracy and against imperialism and racism. You can easily put together a genuinely impressive slate of radical Protestant heroes. But over against them, you've got the authoritarians and the persecutors. The 16th and 17th century Protestant absolutists who in England tortured over 200 Catholics to death for the crime of acknowledging the Pope as head of their church, and who were also very ready to burn Protestant dissidents alive as heretics, and let's not even get started on the witches. The 18th century defenders of absolute state power and imperialism, the 19th century Protestants in this country, who developed a full-throated religious argument that slavery was not only permissible, but was actually God's will for an ideal human society. The 20th century Protestants in South Africa, who first coined the term apartheid, and who argued that defining people by racial categories and separating them into grossly unequal nations was God's will. So you can match your lineup of Protestant heroes with one of Protestant villains, and then you just pick your side depending on what political point you're trying to make, and away you go. For myself, I don't find that a very edifying exercise. So in the time that I've got left, I want to make two suggestions to you about how the politics of Protestantism is playing out and may go on to play out in our own times. The first's about how that balance between those two sides seems to have got out of whack in our own times, maybe particularly here in North America. And the second's about a more hidden, a third strand of Protestant politics that's been there all along and has been making waves across the planet in our own age and may have something to say about the future of Protestantism in America and in Europe too. But first, that American and European story. Here I think we need to notice what is, as I've become persuaded over the last couple of years, the decisive moral event of our age, by which I mean, obviously, World War II. Since 1945, Western societies have had something that we had not had since the end of the age of witch hunting. That is, an all but universally recognized symbol for evil. Nazism has, for our age, come to define evil, and with good reason. But since defining good and evil is traditionally one of the things that religions are supposed to do, the arrival of this essentially secular moral standard has been deeply disruptive to the moral authority of religions, especially of Protestantism, whose record in relation to Nazism was, as I've been suggesting, not one of unmixed heroism. One result of the immense moral shock of World War II is that old-fashioned authoritarian Protestantism almost disappeared. Once you've fought a desperate war against an evil that defines itself by racism and against democracy, then it's quite hard to defend racism and oppose democracy. Incidentally, I think this is why in modern times the South African case stands out so much. Lots of post-war societies were willing to continue being racist and unequal in practice, but apartheid South Africa was pretty much unique in openly defending racism in theory as well. And segregation in the United States hid underneath fictions like separate but equal and lip service to the Reconstruction Amendments. Martin Luther King was quite right to call out the white churches of the South for failing to lift a finger to oppose segregation. But it's also significant that they didn't mount an active theological defense of it, despite the clear views of many of their members. The contrast between that and the active theological defense of slavery before the Civil War, I think, is really clear. And it seems to me that this is why the American civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s cost, by the standard count, something like 41 lives, whereas the apartheid state in South Africa, which had a greater degree of moral self-confidence, killed many more than that in one day at Sharpeville in 1960. Maybe, I'm possibly misreading my audience, but it may be that there's some people here who aren't too enthusiastic about the modern American religious right. But we need to recognize, though, that classic Protestant right-wingery of the kind that unashamedly defends racism, authoritarianism, and human equality does not exist anymore. World War II killed it. But a democratic religious right had already existed, and it at least has flourished since 1945, especially in the United States. It's the Protestant left that's had a really hard time. And its central problem, it seems to me, is that post-1945, it's really hard for Christians, and especially for Protestants, and especially for white Protestants, to assert their particular religious identity in a society which has learnt that respecting pluralism is the only real alternative to totalitarianism. And that means that Christianity can assert itself while campaigning for secular causes, most famously in the American civil rights movement, and that's what made Martin Luther King, in my view, the most significant international Christian leader of the post-war period. And I think the fact that he's now viewed more as a secular hero than as a Christian martyr is really interesting. But it's in the nature of secular campaigns like that that they're not merely religious in their scope. They want to build broad coalitions to include non-Protestant, non-religious, sometimes anti-religious voices. Indeed, for Protestants on the left, there's positive moral and theological value in that kind of diversity. But if you do that, then the one thing you can't do in the course of such a campaign is to assert or reason from the basis of your theological convictions, especially not if you're white. Because white Protestants in the West have still not quite shaken off our inherited assumption that we're normative and therefore have a responsibility to speak for everyone. It's not the historically black churches that feel awkward about asserting their religious identity. The person who sums this up for me is Buzz Aldrin. He's not here today, is he? It's the kind of place. As you may know, Buzz Aldrin is a Presbyterian elder as well as an astronaut. The Apollo astronauts were allowed to take a small quantity of personal items with them, and Aldrin chose to take consecrated bread and wine from his home church. And so before either he or Neil Armstrong went outside, the first food and drink ever consumed on the moon was a Presbyterian communion. Armstrong didn't receive, he's a Unitarian. But the real significance of this event, I think, is the discretion around it. Aldrin wanted to broadcast it live, but there'd been some controversy after the famous Christmas broadcast from Apollo 8 the year before when they read Genesis. And so NASA's flight operations manager discouraged him. And so Aldrin invited each person listening in, wherever and whomever he may be, to contemplate for a moment and to give thanks in his own individual way. And then he closed down the radio to celebrate his communion. And that's sometimes been told as a story of secularist bullying. But I don't think that's the moral to draw from it. Aldrin wrote and spoke many times about how much the event had meant to him. But also, years later, he wondered whether he'd been right to do it at all. He wrote, "Perhaps if I had to do it over again, I wouldn't choose to celebrate communion. Although it was a deeply meaningful experience for me, it was a Christian sacrament, and we'd come to the moon in the name of all mankind, be they Christians, Jews, Muslims, animists, agnostics, or atheists." And of course, we all know what he means. We appreciate that dilemma. But it's also interesting that we're at a moment in history where an earnest and committed Protestant can feel that he's got a duty to speak in the name of all humanity, and therefore, as a matter of conscience, regret privately celebrating the central rite of his own faith. And in the West, at least, that seems to me is where the story stands at present, with Protestants and Catholics following the lead, fading hesitantly into the background. But of course, the global picture is very different. The surge in Christianity in general, Protestantism in particular, across Africa, China, Latin America, is going to have a global significance that we've not yet fully woken up to. My guess is that the withdrawal of Protestantism from the public realm in the West isn't some deep, inevitable process of secularization, but a local and historically specific response to the moral shock of World War II that we're still processing. It's striking that so many Western Protestants have tried to reassert themselves through political activism of one kind or another, whether on the left as part of rainbow coalitions on secular issues, or with a self-conscious religious right, as we've seen here and also more recently and in uglier form in nationalist movements in parts of Europe. But my hunch is that politically significant as those both are in religious terms, they're dead ends. If you turn your religion into a vehicle for political activism, then in the end you abandon your religious principles and end up just pursuing political ones. In the 60s and 70s, progressive Protestants who embraced radical politics often ended up leaving the religion behind and keeping the radicalism. And we've been seeing the same thing happen before our eyes on the right in the last year, as many, not all, on the religious right have, in lending their support to Mr. Trump, strongly suggested that their politics now defines their religion rather than vice versa. Which may sound like I'm saying that Protestantism is just another of the casualties trampled in the bear pit of modern politics. Well, maybe. Although I must say, as an outsider, it seems to me that contemporary America's despair over the intractable partisan divide is overblown. It's not going to last forever. But I also think that focusing on the political and the public face of Protestantism is the wrong way to see its future. So for the final section of this lecture, I want to invite you to climb out of the bear pit with me, if we can, and to see Protestantism's history and its future from another angle. You'll notice that on my lineup of heroes and villains, I didn't assign Martin Luther to one side or another, because he's the prophet of radical individualism and freedom of conscience, who also called for rebellious peasants to be slaughtered and for Jews to be stripped of their legal rights and banished or enslaved. But beneath that contradiction for Luther lay a more profound and unsettling conviction. Luther thought, and you may want to steel yourselves for a heresy, that politics didn't matter very much. He was blunt about the rulers of his own day. He said they were thieves, bullies, fools, and tyrants, and they were no better than sinful humanity deserved. But the purpose of government, he said, is strictly limited. It's to impose some minimal restraint on human evil and to make some limited semblance of peace and order possible. Government is ordained by God. It's necessary in a humdrum way for as long as this passing world endures, but Christians shouldn't pay too much attention to it. Their hearts should instead be set on the kingdom of Christ, where there's no law and no coercion, and which is not passing away. Now, you may say that this apolitical ethic actually sounds like just submission to, or even apology for, authoritarian rule. And of course, to be deliberately apolitical is to give tacit support to whoever happens to be in power. But since its very beginnings, this tradition of withdrawal from and skepticism towards a non-involvement in politics has been more than just craven submission. For Mennonites and others in the broad Anabaptist tradition, for example, being apolitical meant being scrupulously obedient, but also absolutely refusing to be involved in or contaminated by political life in any way, and that included embracing a radical pacifism. That became a minor branch of the tree. But a more significant leap was taken by pietists and evangelicals in the late 17th and 18th centuries, who decided to let go of the apron strings of protective governments, and just bypass political structures. That very Protestant conviction that actually church and state are both better off if neither one interferes with the other gave us, amongst other things, the First Amendment. American secularism is an unmistakably Protestant secularism. If you don't believe me, ask a French or a Turkish person what they mean by secularism. In the amazing surge of new Protestant sects and churches that emerged in the United States in the early 19th century, many of them, it should be said, right here in upstate New York, apoliticism was often a uniting thread. For some of them, that was a rigid principle, like the Jehovah's Witnesses. For some of them, it was more of a sort of flexible aspiration, like the Seventh-day Adventists. And incidentally, I think it's no coincidence that those two are the most racially integrated religious groups in contemporary America. And there are others that just had more pressing things on their minds. The Holiness Methodists of the late 19th century were pursuing moral perfection and empowerment by the Holy Spirit. They just weren't interested in the politics of bimetallism. The Pentecostalism that burst out of the holiness scene in the first decade of the 20th century wasn't opposed to politics as much as profoundly uninterested in it. A rotten business, generally not worth Christians' attention. Early Pentecostals didn't believe it was wrong to vote, and when there were moral issues like prohibition at stake, some of them did. But generally they believed that the corruption and compromises of worldly politics offered nothing of any real value to God's people. It is a view similar enough to Luther's own. The kingdom of this world, as Luther called it, is legitimate, but in a sinful world there are strict limits to what it can achieve, and it doesn't matter all that much. Now, in our own times, apolitical Protestants of this kind have been accused of giving comfort to dictators. And if you look at, for example, the way that South Korean Presbyterians cuddled up to Park Chung-hee's dictatorship, or that Chilean Pentecostals welcomed Augusto Pinochet's coup, you can see why. The presumption that politics is rotten has something inherently right-leaning about it, because so many left-wing policies depend on government intervention. But these apolitical Protestants' relationship with authoritarianism isn't just about submission. In modern times, avowedly apolitical Protestants have periodically been stirred into political action by movements which they see as existential threats. Marxism in Latin America, political Islam in Nigeria, imperial Shintoism in Japanese-occupied Korea and China during World War II. But equally, they've sometimes been able to negotiate coexistence with these movements. In the 1980s, most Protestant leaders in Nicaragua, that's one of Latin America's most Protestant countries, loudly condemned the US-backed Contras, proclaimed their apolitical stance, and avowed their loyalty to the Marxist Sandinista government, much to the surprise and frustration of many American evangelicals. The chief concern of these Nicaraguan Pentecostals was neither the revolution nor counter-revolution, but to be able to preach and enact their gospel. For their part, the Sandinista regime found it hard, as one scholar puts it, to understand why, when the poor needed to defend their gains against the United States and counter-revolution, so many of them were spending their nights clapping and singing. But it was harmless, so the regime was willing to permit it. And it's that demand, that the kingdom of Christ be allowed to govern its own realm, that remains for these apolitical Protestants the key, the non-negotiable political demand, and it has done ever since the 16th century. This is limited, and it's self-centered. And in that sense, it's easy for most governments to buy these people's loyalty. But, as has also been the case since the 16th century, some regimes are unable or unwilling to accept that non-aggression pact. So, in the People's Republic of China, avowedly and painstakingly apolitical Protestants were curtailed and eventually suppressed in the 1950s and 60s. Since the re-legalization of public worship in China in 1979, a large majority of Chinese Protestants have refused to join the officially recognized Protestant church. These unregistered churches are typically scrupulous about avoiding political activism of any kind, but by carving out a space where the party's writ doesn't run, they're already being highly subversive. And the same is true on a more extreme scale of the Protestant churches of Nazi Germany. The so-called confessing church wasn't an anti-Nazi church, it was an apolitical one, insisting on its freedom to decide its own doctrine, worship, and polity, including its right to treat Christians of Jewish descent as full and equal members of the church. That wasn't a campaigning stance, and nor in our terms was it a particularly heroic one, but it was deeply subversive. And indeed, it's worth noticing that the Christian group which offered the most steadfast resistance to the Nazis, the group which in 1937 managed in one night to distribute across Germany 300,000 copies of a secretly printed pamphlet denouncing Hitler as the apocalyptic beast, that church was also the most doggedly apolitical of them all, the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's in the nature of this kind of apolitical Protestantism that it can't tolerate, because it can't be tolerated by totalitarianism of any kind, whether communist, fascist, or theocratic. It can and does tolerate authoritarian governments that are willing to leave it alone. The fact that right-wing authoritarians have in recent times been more willing to do this than left-wing ones doesn't make apolitical Protestants friends of right-wing authoritarianism. There is a genuine affinity between this kind of apoliticism and the principles of the modern democratic centre-right. There's a shared emphasis on self-help and private initiative and individual moral renewal. There's also a corresponding affinity between these apolitical Protestants and the modern democratic centre-left. There's a shared emphasis on human equality and a suspicion of nationalism. I think in particular the competition in Latin America in recent decades between Pentecostalism and Marxism is instructive. Marxism calls the poor to struggle for a future revolution, which is defined as a political event. It tends to be spread in workplaces and in public spheres, and it tends to be led by men. Pentecostalism, by contrast, offers not a chance to sacrifice yourself for a future revolution, but immediate and practical spiritual help, from moral renewal in the face of gangs, drugs, and violence, through promised miracles of healing and deliverance, through to the material benefits offered by the so-called prosperity gospel. It spreads often in the private sphere, through households and families, and very often through women's agency. This is very much a female-dominated religious movement. It offers solutions across the broad front of the troubles that dominate most human lives: health, the security of families, alcohol dependence, money worries. Of course, in practice, it doesn't solve all of these problems all of the time or anything like it, but it does them often enough that the offer works, and certainly does so more reliably than any secular political utopia. And it mobilizes initiative. Big survey of Latin American religious views in 2014 found that more Catholics than Protestants supported government action to help the poor, more Catholics than Protestants favored charitable initiatives to help the poor, more Protestants than Catholics thought that the best way to help the poor was to bring them to Christ. But it also found that many more, twice as many Protestants as Catholics, were actually engaged in or supporting charitable work themselves as individuals. You don't have to like this tradition. I expect many of you don't. I myself am at best ambivalent about it. But I think you need to recognize that one of the really big religious stories of the past 50-odd years is a quiet groundswell of this kind of deliberately apolitical religion. Protestant numbers in Latin America have doubled to 20% of the entire region's population in a single generation. That is an astonishing religious shift. It's every bit as dramatic as the post-60s surge of secularism in North America and in Europe. And there are huge surges in broad Protestant numbers in Africa and in East Asia, movements whose deliberate apoliticism means that they tend to keep out of the public eye, at least until sheer weight of numbers means that the disappearing trick becomes impossible to sustain, as seems to me to have been starting to happen in China in the last few years. Many of these, of course, are countries where the claim that politics is rotten feels not like a contentious theological argument as much as a statement of the blindingly obvious. A gospel which offers salvation by the power of God can seem much more credible than promises of secular salvation at the hands of the state. Which is to say, talking of statements of the blindingly obvious, that Protestantism, this many-faceted tradition whose first 5 centuries we're marking, is not about politics, it's about God. The salvation that it preaches, the salvation which Luther discovered 5 centuries ago, is spiritual. It's a kind of undersea earthquake, which we notice chiefly because of the spectacular and sometimes immensely destructive effects that it has once the waves that it sends out hit obstacles and crest into tsunamis. But that energy comes from somewhere else, many thousands of miles away. And when Protestants have forgotten that and defined their gospel by its this worldly effects, as they sometimes have, they tend to find that the life drains away from it. The centrality of those spiritual concerns has often been exasperating to secular folk who want to do business with Protestants and get frustrated by all this wearisome Jesus talk. But it's unavoidable. Naturally, Protestant spiritual preoccupations have practical consequences. After all, when an overwhelming encounter with God turns your world upside down, nothing, including your politics, is going to be the same. But if we misread those secondary effects as primary, we're going to misunderstand the whole thing. So, because we can't really get away from it, what does this mean for our politics? And especially for the slow-burning crisis of legitimacy which the Western democracies have been enduring for the last 2 or 3 decades as frustration builds at an apparently entrenched and unresponsive political class. Well, I think this rising apolitical tradition could feed into that malign situation in a couple of ways. It could encourage withdrawal from political engagement into the private sphere and the life of the community, which wouldn't, I think, be a good thing, but it might be a rational one. Alternatively, as is beginning to happen in parts of Africa and Latin America, we may find an attempt coming from some of these communities to remoralize politics, pulling countries neither to the left nor to the right, but towards heaven. In particular, as has often been the case by campaigns against corruption. Now, the problems with moralizing politics in this way are only too obvious. Hypocrisy is easily mistaken for piety, piety is a poor substitute for competence, and power corrupts. But it does seem likely that the Western democracy's embittered, moribund, and transactional political culture is going to find a new moral or ideological compass of some kind in the near future. And there are many much, much worse options available. Thank you.
We're going to take questions now, right and left. Please make it a question, and that will give Professor Ryrie the opportunity to actually answer. Thank you.
Since there's only one of you over there, if it's all right, I'm going to start on this side.
So you talk about Martin Luther's ideals melting discrimination like an acid, but it should also be noticed that religion itself was one of the larger actors in keeping that discrimination alive. You talked about how for every religious hero, there is a religious villain. And for every religiously motivated or driven civil rights movement, there is an apartheid. So my question, which is to be certain, a very uncomfortable question, and one to which I do not have a satisfactory answer, nor am I aware of the existence of such an answer. And the question is organized religion worth it? Is the good that organized religion does outweighed, or does it outweigh, the bad that it can lead to?
It's nice to be told before you answer a question that there is no answer to it.
Yeah, I thought that would be a little...
Okay, since we know there's no answer to that, let me give you what I think is a sort of authentically Protestant answer to that, which is that, no, organized religion is a fossil, is a way of confining and killing and crushing the spirit. But nevertheless, it's unavoidable.
Right.
I think you can tell the whole story of Protestantism, indeed, as probably the whole story of Christianity, and indeed, no doubt, of many other religious traditions, as a continuous seesawing between moments of inspiration, which are then hardened and formalized into traditions because they have to be, because that's what human beings need. We need structures, we need rhythms to our life. But of course, as soon as you do that, then the structure itself becomes a dead thing. And you need the next wave of reformers to break it down. So, is it a good thing? No. Is there an alternative?
No, not really.
So, I hope that counts. I think I've now said enough to dodge your question.
Well, that's pretty much the answer I was thinking that I would like to hear, but
okay.
I wasn't
Let's go
sure.
to this side.
Total depravity was a central concept for Calvin and Luther. In the 21st century, how might they speak to that topic, saying it may be still an important concept for human beings to consider in an age where we often seem to be more optimistic about the human person?
That's a great question. I think the cheap answer is to say that I think Luther and Calvin could look around them at the world today and think, yeah, total depravity, that seems to work. I think we can sometimes misunderstand what total depravity means. That the doctrine of original sin that the hard version of the doctrine of original sin that they're preaching is one that I think a lot of modern theologians are uncomfortable with, but they're not saying that everything humans do is purely evil. Indeed, they would argue that pure evil is a meaningless concept. Evil by its nature is impure. It's rather the classic image is of the drop of ink in the bowl of water. There's only one drop of ink, but it gets everywhere. Everything is touched. So I think some of the tensions between hard line positions on this are less difficult to negotiate your way out of than you might think. But it's also that really strong emphasis on the pervasiveness of sin is something that united both Protestants and Catholics in the 16th century. It seemed obvious to everybody on all sides of the religious debate at that time that most things most people do most of the time are pretty awful. I'd like to hope that enough has changed in the times since then that we could say, yeah, maybe let's nuance that a tiny bit.
Okay. Thank you.
I wonder how we can stand in the awe of this stained glass tree, which changes every moment or two, and not acknowledge its teaching to us. Do you see it?
Yeah, indeed.
And I have a question that I love. St. Vincent de Paul said, love is inventive to infinity. I can't not ask that in a week on spirituality and inventiveness. Love is inventive to infinity. I wonder what that might have to say to the tradition of reformata, semper reformanda, reform but always reforming. I wonder what it might have to say to the people who don't believe in a God as such, but love, capital L, is inventive to infinity. What would you think?
Thank you very much for that. I think really all I can say is that I think that sort of approach very much reflects the kind of spirituality that I see resurfacing repeatedly over the centuries of the Protestant tradition. This is why I wanted to start by emphasizing Luther's experience as one of the heart. And that kind of return to heart religion, and indeed, as I was saying to the fellow who was here before, the struggle against formalism and structuralism is one of the key dynamics that's been driving this sort of tradition. So the endless inventiveness, creativity, adaptability is very much part of it. So thank you, that's a great perspective.
Yes, the political and the spiritual and all those opposites.
Sure.
Historical question, going back to the Nazi German period. I had not heard, thank you for sharing, about the Institute to I can't even say it.
It's just a difficult
Take the
word.
Jewishness out of Christianity and the Bible. I had heard about the Confessing Church, of course, but I had also heard that at one time Hitler more or less actively courted the leadership of the state church in Germany to say that there was no problem with Nazi doctrine versus Christian doctrine, and that was a big part of him gaining some acceptance among the religious folk, which of course the Confessing Church went the other way with. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I take it that what you're referring to is what happens in the first year or so of the Nazis' being in
Yes.
power. This so-called German Christian movement is founded in, I believe, in 1932. They want to call themselves the National Socialist Christians, the Nazi Christians. Hitler, who's very protective of the Nazi brand, won't let them do that, and so insists on German Christians as an alternative. Once the Nazis seize power, there's a sort of moment of uncertainty in the National Protestant Church about what they're going to do, how they're going to respond to this. There's this crucial meeting that April where they decide whether to make a formal protest about the first round of pogroms and attacks on Jewish businesses and individuals that have been happening. And for a series of complicated and interesting and really depressing reasons, they decide not to. And Hitler then pushes through a restructure of the church. He wants to impose, it's been very kind of a very loose federation up to that point. He wants to centralize it. He wants a single Reich bishop who's going to head it, and he's got a candidate in mind. And when that's blocked, he insists on national church elections, that each of the 27 regional churches should elect a new bishop and other leadership. He calls those elections on 1 week's notice. The German Christians are pre-warned. They already have a slate of candidates lined up. The result is that, well, I mean, the opposition managed to mobilize, I think, reasonably impressively under the circumstances, but the German Christians win 24 out of the 27 regional elections. Those other three become a kind of crucial sort of residue and base from which the anti or non-Nazi parts of the church can operate. And the day before the elections, Hitler gives a notorious broadcast in which he pretty much explicitly calls on the people to vote for the German Christian candidates. But after that, the regime backs off. And there's, in particular, when there's a notorious speech at a rally that autumn by one of the German Christian leaders where he calls for the Old Testament to be thrown out of the Bible. And that produces a huge backlash. People have been willing to go along with a certain amount of casual anti-Semitism, but they don't want to do this. And it's partly in response to that the Confessing Church is formed, a church which is not anti-Nazi, but is saying we need to be allowed to run our own affairs and to define our own gospel. And in some ways, one of the most remarkable things is that the Nazis let that happen. The Confessing Church is harassed. Its most important leader is eventually put in a concentration camp, Martin Niemöller, but it's allowed to continue existing. It's allowed to hold synods, to meet, to maintain a national organization. There's nothing else like it in Nazi Germany. And I think that's indicative of the way that the regime has backed off and is deliberately saying, we have no dog in this fight. We regard all the church parties as in some ways equally ridiculous, and we don't want to back aside. So, sorry, that was a long answer.
No,
it's a really interesting and really grim story.
But the basic idea of the Nazis was that the Christianity would just kind of wither away and
wither away, perhaps with some encouragement.
Yes.
Just a quick follow-up comment on that. It seems that the lockup that the church had in 1933 is the problem that many people may say we face historically, and that is when people say, don't listen to what they're saying, let's wait to see what their actions are. That is a very, very dangerous stance to take. My question to you, though, is on a little bit different stance, and it somewhat follows Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, and that is, what is the overriding social justice creed? I understand not wanting to get involved with politics with a big P. I mean, George Washington warned us all about political parties. But what about dealing with it outside of a partisan role? And where are the churches if on a uniform basis or a unified basis?
I mean, this is the classic critique of the kind of apolitical religion that I was talking about at the end, which just wants to back off and say, well, we're only interested in defending our own sphere. And I think one of the things that the experience of the last century or more makes clear is that there are times, many times, when that's simply inadequate as a response. But, well, let me give you a sort of slightly sideways answer to that, drawing on the experience of the churches in South Africa under apartheid, where there was the Dutch Reformed Church that was openly backing the apartheid regime, which is, I think, is really interesting and important, and the fact that they then lost confidence in that seems to me really decisive in the way that apartheid came to an end, but that's separate. Amongst the other churches, the interracial churches, there were the traditional English-speaking churches, as they're usually referred to in South Africa, the international denominations, which by the 70s and 80s were increasingly vociferous and active in campaigning for racial justice and equality and democracy, and really helping to drive this forward internationally. You also had the so-called independent churches, the African independent churches that often didn't belong to any international denominational structures, were very often just sort of one-stop shops, entirely independent, free, most of which had no involvement in the political struggle at all, and indeed were scarcely communicating with the established English-speaking churches. And some of them, indeed, were openly collaborating with the regime and were paid for this. I mean, that's a really uncomfortable situation. And when you look at the ways that they responded, that those churches responded after the end of the regime to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was set up during the 90s, there was a split. Some of them said, we have to repent for our cowardice, for the way that we failed to defend our people. And some of them said, the defense that we gave to our people was prayer, was giving them the dignity to stand in their own place and to be themselves. Whether that's an adequate answer, I'm not comfortable with it, but I can feel the power of it for the people who are involved. So I think there are problems with the assumption that whenever there's a social injustice, that it's the appropriate role of a church theologically to tackle it, which would be my own instinct. But when I look at how it's worked out in practice, I think it may be slightly more complicated than that.
Sounds like there's a differentiation of one's version of faith, whether it's self-focused or God-focused as opposed to society, and it's perhaps a little difficult to stand on the outside and
it is,
evaluate.
and there are times when that tension breaks down unmanageably. But I think there's a genuine tension to be navigated there.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Okay.
Okay.
These are in 2 parts and related to those who preceded me. But I wondered if you would talk more about the ongoing Reformation, the legacy that still existed in the early Protestant movement of Constantinianism. With this sword I conquer, and the establishment of church and state, and then how they turned and persecuted the Anabaptist movement and tried to eradicate it. And so how do those Baptistic groups with no force in matters of religion, over and against, with this we conquer, a kind of wedding of the official church with those, and the legacy that exists today in what we call mainline churches.
Sure.
Because mainline means the right side of the tracks, and they're the established ones, and everyone else, whether Jehovah's Witness or whatever, is. So talk about that Reformation of the Reformation as we move things forward and not get entrenched in our own identity to the point where we can't see where God might be taking us?
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, it's in the nature of the whole idea of Reformation that it's an ongoing process. I mean, there is a sort of moment in that first generation where some people seem to think it's something that we can do and then stop. And there's a realization comes over, no, this is going to have to be a continuous, you're swimming against the tide the whole time, the tide of all those forces of decay and fossilization and corruption. But there's a particular point you're talking about, which is the relationship with state power and Constantinianism. And I mean, I need to acknowledge here that I'm a licensed minister of an established church where, in theory, the Queen still appoints the bishops of my church, and she's a wonderful lady. But even so, I'm profoundly uncomfortable with this. But that sort of legacy, which we have been breaking down since in some ways since the beginning with the Anabaptists, has been much more mainstream since the 17th, 18th century. I think the really hard-edged, dangerous features of that sort of Constantinianism are, I think they're behind us now. This is a process of Reformation which really is ongoing, and those sorts of imperialistic ambitions are being driven out.
Officially?
But they're pervasive.
Yeah.
And it does seem to me that the tremendous leap forward that was taken in this country that's represented by the First Amendment is one of the main reasons why the religious life of this country is so much more vibrant and varied than that of the... Well, I don't want to start banging, fighting, but so I'm not going to use terms like sterile monoculture. But the ongoing dangerous legacies of state churches or post-state churches across a lot of Europe, I think are still deeply malign.
Thank you.
If you go back to our founding, the people in Congress who voted for independence were by and large religious, ethical, moral people, but they put aside the question of slavery for the greater common good of, as Franklin said, independence first, then slavery, knowing that it was immoral, but they couldn't deal with it then. So at what point for people in government do they set aside their religious views for the greater common good, knowing that they're going to push a problem down the road, but they can't deal with it right now? Where do you draw the line there?
Well, happily, I don't need to draw that line. But let me say something about how the tradition does it. I think this is where Luther's idea of the distinction between the kingdom of this world and the kingdom of Christ, although it's problematic, is I think quite helpful for thinking about questions like this. That it gives you a certain pragmatism. It recognizes that the kingdom of this world is about managing the situation that we find ourselves in. Recognizing that we are sinners in an imperfect world and that we are not going to make it into a perfect one. And therefore, it's about sensibly doing the best thing you can under the circumstances. That's not to say that the decision that the founders made was right under that circumstance, but there seems to me the sort of calculus that you would use for making those sorts of decisions, rather than necessarily choosing an absolute moral principle and pursuing it regardless of the cost or consequences. Clearly, sometimes there are principles that which are sufficient value that you are willing to pay very high costs and accept very considerable consequences. But I think that sort of pragmatic calculation is made possible by the way that Luther thinks about it. And in terms of just the kind of plumbing business of politics, of how you actually practically solve problems, that seems to me not a bad way of thinking about it.